I'll wait another minute. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you. So Juliana and Rachel, you're running your review session, right? For quiz 3 on Thursday?
Yeah, at 4 o'clock on Zoom.
Okay, all right. And if you log in into Zoom, you will see the session and you can actually connect through there, right? From Canvas. Yeah.
Mhm.
So at the end of the class today, if you have any questions for me, if you want me to look at something, we can do that. Okay, all right, let's start. Any questions before we begin? So again, for those who are just joining us, Juliana and Rachel are running a review session for the quiz 3 on this Thursday at 4 o'clock, and you can join it by following Zoom link on Canvas. So we're going to do that, see how that affects your marks and whatnot. I want to start by asking you please to define the word gaze, the term gaze on chat. Um, it's right there. So if everyone please just write me kind of what they remember from last time's discussion or anything that you can kind of come up with about the gaze very quickly. We'll start with that and then we'll go and look at the kind of extended material and definition. Okay, great. So Marisa says it requires looking like kind of prolonged looking and has kind of some power struggle, more so power relation than power struggle, kind of like where one person is kind of has more power than the other. Gaze is sustained look, says Ashley, a meaningful look, the visual examination of something pleasurable, interesting, attractive. Okay, that's a good definition. Kind of needs a little bit more, and we're gonna go through that. It's a little more than that. Gaze is the way you look at something in regards to your relationship with the object. That is good. So yeah. So it's a sustained look that has power relationship embedded in there. So one person is kind of more active than the other. Um, okay, so I think we have a couple more people who I think still working on that. So please do that. I've got Daniel and Tanner. I think still working on that. So if you could do that, that would be great. I'm going to start screen share and start kind of going through the material with you. Okay, that's not slideshow, presenter view. Okay. All right. So last time we talked about modernity, right? And the kind of the idea of modernism and when did it start? And then hopefully you remember that. I'm just kind of skipping through. And then we looked at the Jacques Lacan's kind of idea of the mirror stage. Hopefully you would remember that. This little, oh, come on. that little person here. And we talked about kind of how mirror stage essentially explains why we enjoy watching things so much, or kind of like when we enjoy spectacles and especially narrative shows. And then we went into the idea of the gaze, and we talked about kind of that idea how we would check someone out and really evaluate them for their looks, but also kind of make judgments about them, right? We've done that. Any questions on that? So very often we talk about kind of the idea of the gendered gaze. And right here, I'm just showing you two advertisement of quite old, I think, a few years ago by Ralph Lauren, Romance, and that's perfume. So, and these really encapsulate that idea of the power relationship and gendered gaze in advertisement very well. Because first of all, what happens here is that these two people are here for our display. But I think you would agree with me that we see the kind of skin and face of a woman a lot more than we see the man. And so while man is seen to be completely into the woman, he's completely into her and kind of completely subsumed by what he feels. The woman at the same time turns around and kind of invites the viewer, to look at her and kind of take the scene in. So she's letting us gaze at her and at the scene in general. So here, very often in advertisement, we see that where the person who kind of invites the gaze, allows the gaze to come in, they creates this kind of eye contact, is the woman, and that's part of the gendered gaze. Okay, so then in your chapter, there is a kind of an examination of Diego Velázquez Las Meninas as an example of the not just the gaze itself, but the field of the gaze. So how the field of the gaze works in this particular painting, and then it also allows us to kind of to think more about this idea of kind of power relationship between people who look. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on that right now. So this is a painting by a French artist, very important and very well researched and written about artist, Diego Velázquez. He painted it in 1656 while being part of the Spanish court. He was the court painter at that time. So this is the portrait of Velázquez himself, Diego Rodriguez de Silva e Velázquez, born in 1599 and died in 1660. So as you can see, then he painted Las Meninas in 4 years before he died, and really he was at the peak of his performance as an artist, and also kind of wealth and influence as a courtier, as someone who is actually part of the court life. So the thing about Las Meninas that is really kind of gives us pause is the fact that we are not sure what Velázquez is actually representing, because Las Meninas in Spanish, in the context of the painting, means ladies in waiting. So, and if we look at the painting, the two ladies in waiting are the two young women with kind of very elaborate hair and bows that stand by either side of the little girl. Now, here's the issue. The ladies in waiting hierarchically in the court order are a lot lower than, for example, the little girl, who is the infanta, who is the princess. She's the princess. And they also, all of them then, are lower in the hierarchy of the court than the king and the queen that are presumably being painted at that point. So I have a detail here to show you. So this is the Infanta, right? This is Maria Theresa, the little girl. And there is a mirror at the very back of the painting. So this is the painting, right? And this is the mirror. And the mirror shows us the king and queen who are standing then, if they are reflected in the mirror, then they are standing presumably where we would stand as the viewer. And then we have Velasquez right here painting the queen and the king. Okay, so this is the artist, this is his canvas. We are standing where king and queen would stand, and we're being painted. So why is the painting called Las Meninas? And if it's called Las Meninas, what is it then? So presumably if he's painting a portrait, it's a portrait, but at the same time, then portrait of who? So what Velasquez is doing, he's kind of destabilizing the categories for us and kind of making our life as the viewer a little bit more difficult. They're asking us, okay, what are we looking at again? What are we supposed to take in? Usually, a portrait is something that, this is a portrait, for example. The Infanta Maria Theresa, that same girl, but few years later, she grew up. The daughter of King Philip. So this is a traditional portrait, right? She is showcased in her like very formal attire. She's very mighty. Look at her hair. The artist himself showcases how well he can convey all that. He's definitely an incredible craftsperson. He's an incredible painter, right? So this is a portrait. We understand that. That would be a portrait, something like that, lady of the court. But what is this? So this is Velasquez trying to kind of to make portraiture less formal, if you will. So what happens here is probably, and really nobody, he never wrote about that, so we're not really sure. That's kind of reconstructions and theories of art historians. So what probably happened here is that Velasquez was painting the king and the queen. All of a sudden the door opens and the little Maria Theresa, the little Infanta, runs in. She looks like she's probably 5 or 6. She's quite young. Of course, she never comes alone. She has a whole entourage, the whole accompaniment of people. So in come in the 2 ladies in waiting, plus the dog, plus the two other people who usually accompany her. Those are little people, and they usually kind of play the role of a jester or kind of a friendly entertainer in the court, especially for young children. So this entire kind of like mob of people comes inside and completely destroys the formality of the portrait. Now, because all these people are quite young or not necessarily in authority, behind them we see 2 other people. So these tend to be the teachers of the little girl, the teachers or the kind of educators of the little girl who are behind her. And finally, we really don't understand, and I'm serious. There are several different ways of explaining that. Right here, behind the door is open, and there is this man who is standing there. Now, the man was actually identified. We know who that is. He is the person who is responsible. He's like in modern terms, he's like the main caretaker of the palace. He also accidentally has the same name as Velasquez, but we don't think they are related in any ways. So we have this kind of very elaborate relationship between the people. right? So now let's look at who is looking at whom. We've got Infanta that is looking at us. Then we have the ladies in waiting. One of them is clearly looking at the Maria Theresa. The other one kind of also is looking at more at the viewer, or she's kind of like, or when we say the viewer, we also imagine that this is a king and queen, right? So the king and queen then look right ahead because we see them in the mirror. Velasquez, of course, is looking at us slash the king and queen. The two teachers seem to be talking to each other. The boy here is paying attention more so to the dog than anything else. And this little person again looks at king and queen, kind of checks, is that okay that we are here? So if you will, the in terms of the kind of positioning, Las Meninas is almost like the first flash mob that is depicted in art history. It really is kind of like that almost hijacked scene that is hijacked by the princess. So what it also shows us very carefully is that idea of kind of looking and gendered looking, but also hierarchical looking. So here I have essentially kind of like the more or less the summary of what I said. The most important part here is that we see here kind of the idea of external slash ambiguous spectator, because with Las Meninas we really don't have one person who oversees it all. We are put in a position of king and queen, and there's this kind of duality of meaning. As a spectator, we substitute the king and queen, which is a very a very kind of cheeky thing to do on the part of Velasquez, because he essentially kind of reduces king and queen to the position of anybody who would look at the painting. Okay, so the most interesting part perhaps of all that is the person at the door, or the door itself. So we have here, so this is the ambiguous spectators, the Las Meninas, the ladies in waiting. The composition shows 5 of the room's planes, including floor and ceiling. So we have all these 5 dimensions. At the door, we have Jose Nieto Velasquez, and we're not sure if he's a relative of the artist. And as spectators, we substitute king and queen. Now, this is Royal Alcazar of Madrid, the royal castle of Madrid. This is where the king and queen and the family court lived, and this is the actual structure. As you can see, and we're looking at the court that was incredibly ceremonial and incredibly rigid in its rituals, and also in terms of absolute monarchy. The monarch was the monarch and the church, and they ruled together, and they ruled with the iron fist. So then when it's almost like if you can think about it as a kind of like a mini country, a mini community, where all people knew their place. So when we're in the room, and when Velasquez portrays for us this room, and then he opens the door out of the room, and there's a light at the back, it's almost, he suggests that there is that exit, it's really, there's no direct separation between the inside of the room, and it's very stuffy, very solemn, very ritualistic atmosphere, and what is on the outside. He kind of gives us kind of an idea that there is also out of here, there's also light and more freedom. And Infante in a way symbolizes that kind of freer association of freer life at the court, because she's so young. So this is the idea of the Las Meninas as a gaze, as a field. So art historian Jason Farraga says by putting himself within the image looking out, the painter photobombs the image. So the painter himself kind of becomes that photobomb. It disrupts the circuit of power between the king and the queen, because we're essentially presented with kind of various gazes. And the door symbolizes the outside, away from princes, from royalty. I misspelled royalty, sorry, etc. Okay. Questions, comments before we go further. Okay, so in the chat, Rachel put a great video on analysis of Las Meninas. If you need understanding what is going on in Dr. Maiselov is talking about, great. Okay, so yeah, you may want to save that for later, and I will check it out. Okay, so let's continue and let's figure out the idea of the discourse. Okay, so I will connect that to the gaze in a sec. We're going to look at the idea of the discourse. So the discourse and power. So the gaze, of course, is an element of power, right? If we're gazing, we're looking at someone, and we have the power. Discourse is also an element, kind of an element of power, but wider one. So discourse, it means that all the knowledge that we have at any given time on any given subject. Okay, so for example, discourse of madness is everything we know about madness at this particular point. We don't call it madness anymore, right? We call it kind of mental issues, mental instability, mental health, etc. But okay, so discourse of mental health is everything we know, including the history of madness, as it was called prior. At this given time, discourse of gender is everything we know and kind of understand at this particular point about gender, etc. So discourse is equals to what Ronald Barthes sometimes calls the myth. The myth is kind of becomes part of the discourse. So let me give you one example of that idea of power and the gaze, and it fits within the discourse. This is Jeremy Bentham Panopticon from 1791. Okay, so remember we talked about the gaze and kind of that idea of looking. Now, what happens if you are in jail, or if you're a guard in jail? Then the power relationship between someone who is guarding and guarded is really important, right? There's clear power differentiation. So here I have for you a project that Jeremy Bentham, who was an architect and a philosopher, created in 1791. He decided that he there's a much better way to guard people and put them in jail than what was normally kind of accepted, which would be a very thick wall, smallish windows. You put someone in, and there is a guard by the door, a guard at the end of the hallway, and you lock the doors. But the problem with that is that you don't know what the person is doing all the time. You just create circumstances and conditions that they cannot get out. Bentham says, hey, wait, we can do better than that. So what he created is the mechanism or architecture that can actually allow the guard to see the prisoner all the time, 24/7, or at the very least for prisoner to think that they are being seen 24/7. So this is the jail. So the cells are located, and I have a better one here. I'll show you, like more contemporary. This is in Cuba. This is kind of the implementation of that idea in Cuba. Okay, so look, These are cells, and obviously now it's destroyed. And this is the booth and the balcony of the guard. So if those cells are closed all the time, but there's a glass pane at the front, then the the person in the cell can be seen all the time. That's the initial idea of the surveillance that Bentham had put together. It took him a very long time to actually get people to understand and kind of appreciate his idea. So this is in Cuba, this is in Quebec. It's also not working anymore, but it was until the 90s or so. But this is what concerns us. So this is the place where the guard would be, and these are the cells. So the people in the cell would be able to kind of think about it, that they are surveyed, that they are completely on view 24/7. So that idea then was taken by a philosopher, Michel Foucault. And Foucault is really important for visual culture, and we're going to look at him several times, but this is one of our instances. So Michel Foucault described the implications of panopticism. So this is the panopticon, and that idea of the surveillance then becomes the panopticism, kind of as a noun. In his 1975 book, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. And I have here a couple of things for you, but before you start kind of writing this down, let me explain to you what Foucault generally means, because it's very important. He says that the power and ideologies penetrate people not so much by punishing individual person, but actually creating discourse that helps us to avoid punishment. So in other words, instead of promising and threatening us with punishment all the time, the society is smart enough in most cases to create a system where they say, hey, see how wonderful it is to be free? See how wonderful it is to be quote unquote normal? You should be that, because the circumstances of not being normal or not being abiding the laws are really horrible. But we don't, as a society, very often we don't talk about the jail so much. We have some preoccupation with that, but this is at the back. The most important part of kind of how society makes us obedient is by disciplining us, and not so much by punishing, by encouraging us to be disciplined. So it's like, it's if you think about it as a kind of as a discussion in class, usually what we do as professors, we would encourage you to get better, right? We would encourage you, we would set the standard that A is a good thing because you can do this and that. And if we're smart enough, we are not going to threaten you with a D or a fail all the time, because that's not the point, and it doesn't work as well. So this is the idea of discipline and punish. The idea of the discipline, and the idea that as a person, as a kind of a person, part of the society, you are constantly being watched somehow. You're constantly being evaluated. So I'm now looking at my first bullet here. The major effect of panopticon is to induce in the inmate state a conscious and permanent visibility that assures automatic functioning of the power. Or in other words, we, even if we're not in jail, look at the surveillance cameras, etc., everywhere. We feel that we are being watched and evaluated all the time, and we're internalizing that, and we are essentially becoming part of the society. That's how we become indoctrinated. questions, comments on that? No? All right. So again, surveillance cameras, and nowadays the surveillance cameras and the kind of the idea of the surveillance, remember at some point, Mark Zuckerberg was interviewed, and someone saw that he closed his computer camera, and et cetera, et cetera. There's constant discourse, there's constant discussion of to what extent we're being watched. This is one thing. The other way that the society enforces power on us is through something called biopower. So if we look at kind of that idea of being healthy, society wants us to be healthy, right? Society wants us to look this in a particular way. The capitalism, kind of the idea of consumption, is very important. So to control people better, there's something called biopower. And here I'm showing you actually a spread from a Nazi propaganda brochure, but trust me, it didn't necessarily change. So biopower is kind of disciplining your body. And this is one example as exercising. So the society always tell us how we should look. In Nazi Germany, the ideal was the very, very healthy and muscular body, right? So we're looking here at women. In the 19th century, early 20th century, the society everywhere in Europe and out of Europe told women that they had to have really narrow waists and really wide hips. So corsets corset is an example of biopower for sure. So that this idea of how you're supposed to look. Nowadays, we are very much encouraged to exercise. And people like Valerie Steele, who is a fashion historian and fashion theorist, says that the corsets really were never abandoned. It's just that now we're trying to create our internal corsets, for example, by exercising and creating strong abdominal muscles to serve as a corset. So there's always that kind of a desire to control people. And that, what I'm saying, is all taken from Michel Foucault. And he's been criticized many times because he's kind of overestimating how much the government or the kind of powers that be kind of influence people, and he doesn't take into consideration kind of that we as people can talk back, etc. But this is the idea. So biopower is the power of influence how our bodies and behavior relating to our looks works into our kind of social norms. Then finally, we also have here kind of this idea of the gaze as otherness. So I'm showing you here Edward Sheriff Curtis. Edward Curtis's photographs of the North American Indian. He created a large album of these of the representations like that in the early 20th century, 1903. So, okay, so what does that do? In this case, Curtis decided that he's going to document Aboriginal people. And the idea was that Aboriginal people, the Indian people, were, because of the increasing modernization and kind of push to assimilate, the cultures are disappearing, right? So they are going to, very soon we're not going to see what people, and it's normal. In many ways, it's normal for cultures to change and mutate and slowly kind of change into something else and disappear occasionally. Now, when Curtis started his project and he started traveling, he especially traveled in Midwest, but also all over the United States, he realized that in many ways he came too late. When would come to places where people, Aboriginal people lived, he didn't see them wearing what he imagined they would wear. So this is what he did. He then went to a kind of clothing dealer, and he created a very large collection of the Native Americans' clothing. And then he started going around with like trunks and trunks of this clothing, and he would sometimes ask people, sometimes pay them a little bit to dress up in what kind of they thought would be suitable slash he thought would be suitable for them, do the hair, do everything, do the look, and then photograph them. So what he did is he really created this anthropological gaze for us and for himself, where we're looking at people who are supposedly uh, still there but disappearing, but essentially already changed their ways of life and culture. But he kind of brings them and leaves them in the past. So that's kind of gaze and otherness, or anthropological gaze. Now, that is very much with us today as well. And I'm not necessarily saying it's always a bad thing, but we have to understand that when we look at something like that, we are practicing an anthropological gaze. And in many cases, when photographs like that are being taken, the people who are in the photographs may or may not even realize that they are there and that where the picture is going to go, which is problematic and creates a lot of issues. So questions, comments in relation to that? So let me introduce you to the idea of Jacques Derrida and probably kind of wrap it up at this point. So the Jacques Derrida essentially talks about modernity, the idea, and he's a postmodern scholar. So he's the one that actually very much responsible for finish or challenge to modernity. So modernism, we talked about modernism as a place where truth, for example, we know this is the truth, this is false. We know where people kind of belong. There's a particular hierarchical structure where people belong. For example, class structure in Western society, caste structure in places like India is all part of this idea of modernity. So Jacques Derrida says we live in the world that is powered by binary oppositions: white, black, man, woman, straight, gay, center, margin, normal, deviant, etc., etc. So these are those are the oppositions. Now, he says, but the truth is that our society normally functions on the premise that white and black are not only two categories. There's a lot of things in between. There are not only men and women. There are not only straight and gay people. There are people that, like, it's all spectrum, right? It's not only black and white, it's gray everywhere. So it's kind of like that's the idea. Now, moreover, in our society, one is being normalized. So white is the normal, man is the normal, straight is the normal, center is the normal, etc. Kind of one is the dominant white, and black is the other side. Now, but in order to have white, we also need black, because the binary oppositions are mutually dependent. We cannot just have white as a main characteristic of, say, skin color without comparing it to something else. So this kind of these are, he calls binary opposition, and what he normally does is he's trying to deconstruct them or destroy them and say that makes no sense. We function as a society very often, but in reality, once we kind of go from prevailing ideology to the reality, that is not the case. We do not have only only either or. We have a whole spectrum of things. So that's his challenge to that idea. So I've talked about today about the gaze, an idea of the field of the gaze. So again, it's not only the gaze, the gazer, the person who looks, and the person who is being looked at. As a field, we have kind of whole methods or hierarchy of looks. I talked about discourse as being kind of a field of knowledge about a particular subject, such as mental health or gender. I talked about the idea of the biopower. So biopower being kind of idea of ex- controlling how we look and therefore how healthy we are through prescriptive ideas of how we're supposed to look and strive. And finally, we talked about the idea of the otherness and the gaze, and kind of how we othering other cultures. We create them as a kind of we perpetuate essentially the opposition between West other or us other by actually looking at other cultures anthropologically in many ways at times, not always. Questions, comments?
I just had a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, are docile bodies like individuals who give biopower?
Yeah, the docile bodies are bodies that are essentially kind of the biopower is exercised upon them.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Anything else? All right. If not, then I will say goodbye. Any questions about the module? Sorry, before the module 3 work is due on March 8th. Do we have any questions on that? No? All right. If you do, and then you know how to find me. If you need to talk to me during my office hour, just email and I'll set the appointment. Other than that, have a wonderful week and I will see you next Monday. Bye.